Hi, I'm Rachel, and this is my Author's Answer video for March 2020. The Author's Answer series was started by J.D. Archer and his writing group, where they posed a bunch of reading and writing related questions to one another. J.D. made a whole playlist of his answers to these on AuthorTube, and I will link to his playlist and also my AuthorTube playlist down below. I answer one of these sequentially, one per month, and I am up to question number 36, which is to talk about if or would you write about sex in your writing. And the short answer to that, or at least the if, is that no, I haven't really. I think the closest I've come to writing about the sex act in my own writing is a line in my literary fiction novella that said that after fighting with her boyfriend slash fiance, Lena made love to him, which is their custom. As to if I would and why, I hearken back to a booktube tag that kind of goes along these lines, a tag about sex and reading. And some weeks ago, Steve Donahue did this tag, and he posited the bold claim that writing about the sex act directly is never literature, and it's also always an act of pornography that doesn't really say anything. And I'll link to his video down below. But that got me to thinking, if I agree with that, if there is or isn't any case where talking directly about the sex act in fiction is actually illuminating something about the characters, rather than just being porn on its face. And I don't have any examples to talk about in specific because well, I'd rather not have this video get flagged as inappropriate in any way. And I think my answer kind of comes down to a complication of that, yes, I do think that depicting sex can be an act of showcasing character, but usually that it's still abstract. I mean, maybe you could talk about people's bodies moving atop one another during the act of penetration without specifically going into the physics of what is happening, but still it's the act, you know, from how the bodies are moving. And along with that, there can be an exploration of what the sex act means to the people involved. Specifically, most recently, I guess I'm thinking of a Celeste Ng novel, Everything I Never Told You, where her discussing the way the bodies of her two characters are moving talks about the sense of tentativeness to intimacy that crops up between these two lovers. I do think that sometimes depicting the sex act in fiction can be nothing more than pornographic, and personally I would agree that there's not really much to be said for that, and I would probably stay away from that in my own fiction if I ever do come about to depicting the sex act in fiction, because it just doesn't seem to have a point. And most recently I read the book Naama by Sarah Blake, which depicted the sex act directly in a lot of scenes, and I didn't feel like it added anything to the story. It didn't really tell us anything or illuminate anything about the characters and their situation, and after a while it seemed to be an indulgence on the author's part and nothing more. But in general, I do think it's possible to describe characters as emotions during the sex act with some depictions of the sex itself that can add something to the story and illuminate something about the characters, and maybe something about sex in the world and how people experience it. I go back to Meg Wolitzer especially, who I think describes sex from the female vantage point quite well. Though the first example I can think of that has stuck in my head ever since I read it from the first book of hers I read is in the Interestings, where Jules is following her then boyfriend up onto his bunk so that they can have sex, and she's basically watching his member. And so I guess in that way, I mean, that's not explicitly the sex act. I mean, at best that's some sort of foreplay. So, and even that's a stretch. Maybe it's really just acknowledging private parts, which feels explicit because we know the sex is coming and that we just don't usually talk about private parts. So yeah, at most I think it would be relatively rare to even go explicitly into the sex act. And when and if it happens in a way to describe the emotions or the reality for the characters, it wouldn't linger on the penetration. It would just give that physical context along with the emotional context. I'm hoping all of this makes sense because I'm talking abstractly, and I also think that ultimately most worthwhile sex that writers put into their fiction is more on the abstract side than the lingering on the physicality side. An adjacent question to this, because so far I've been focusing on consensual sex, is the depiction of rape, and also adjacent to this is the depiction of rape in adaptations in visual media versus in novels. I'm bringing this up, I guess, to talk about something more specifically, something that I watched recently the other night as the second season of My Brilliant Friend came to the States on HBO. My Brilliant Friend is, well, technically the first novel of the Neapolitan series by Elena Ferrante, and the second series is technically adapting her second book, A Story of a New Name. And the first episode depicts the marital rape on the wedding night between Lila and her husband Stefano. It's something we get to see on the TV show that we don't actually in the book, because Lenu is the constant narrator of the books, and she's not there, you know, physically on Lila's wedding night. She hears about this secondhand. And perhaps it's an argument, especially with violence, that it can be more powerful even to hear about it secondhand, that it feels even more emotionally deranged and damaging to infer it after we do see Lenu's witnessing of some of the physical violence, but especially of Lila's emotional state, which is obviously indirectly related to that violence in that rape. And I might even say, and I wonder if it's a cultural thing, because I remember in Game of Thrones, in the depiction of sexual violence on Game of Thrones, and even just sex in general, where that existed, is that I think American and European audience differed on the graphic depiction of it, and there's been some pushback, I think, in the States that might not be there entirely, just given fan reaction in Europe about the depiction, especially of rape on television. And certainly as I was watching the scene between Stefano and Lila in episode 1, I felt like it was lasting a really long time, and I don't know, I wondered if it lost some potency, even though I don't think in any case it was depicted as anything titillating for the audience, because Lila had been more of our point of view character than Stefano, and she was obviously fighting back against it. But anyway, I might be going off on a tangent. There is something to be said of there being something different in depicting consensual sex versus sexual violence. And personally, I feel like there's less value in lingering on the physical depiction of sexual violence and perhaps also violence in general than there is in lingering on consensual sex. The feelings in consensual sex, I think, are more immediate. I mean, that it does have a lot of times some lasting impact, but there's more to be said for what it says about the characters in the moment when it's their choice, versus sexual violence, where the majority of the emotional impact on the character would happen afterwards anyway. So that's my rambling, hopefully appropriate for YouTube take. Probably a good time to be a small fry over here. Flying under the radar. But anyway, I hope I said something intriguing or worth thinking about in this video, and that about covers it for me now. Man, now everything's going to feel like innuendo too, so maybe I should just sign off. Thanks so much for watching, everyone, and I'll see you next time.